Hi, my name is Diane Soliano and I'm here to present about the cardiac cycle. So first things first, what is the cardiac cycle? So the cardiac cycle is the period from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next. In other words, this is the sequential contraction and relaxation of the atria and ventricles produced by electrical changes, pressures, and mechanical actions that constitutes the cardiac cycle. So before we dive into the cardiac cycle, I want to have a fast chemistry of the heart and the process of the blood flow. So the heart. The heart works as a primary pump that circulates the blood through the entire vascular system. It has four chambers: the right atrium, the left atrium, or known as the upper chambers, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle, known as the lower chambers. So here we have the blood flow. So the first stage is that the blood enters the heart through the atria. Second is that when the atria contracts, they push the blood into the ventricle. Third is when the ventricles contract, they push the blood out of the heart. Next is we have our main topic in this presentation, that is the cardiac cycle. So we have here an example of an ECG or an electrocardiogram. So in this ECG, we're going to focus first on this hill of a line, this little bump right here. That is what we call the P wave. So the P wave shows that the polarization of the atria. I'm very sorry about this typo here. It shouldn't be I, it should be A. I'm very sorry about that. So again, a P wave shows that the polarization of the atria. It means that uh, the polarization means it is an electrical signal that travels within the atria, and it is responsible for giving the signal for the atria to contract. So when the atria contracts, that is now what we call an atrial contraction or an atrial systole, because systole means contraction. And because of that, there is an increase in atrial pressure. So for us to better see the atrial contraction, we have to focus our eyes on this yellow line, which is the atrial pressure. So you might be wondering what happens to the blood when there is an increase in atrial pressure. So the blood will flow from the AV valve to the ventricle. Since there is blood filling up the ventricle, there is now an increase in ventricular volume, which we can also see in the ECG here. There's a slight bump in the ventricular volume. Now, on to the next stage, we have the QRS complex. And in the ECG, this is where we can see the QRS complex. So, it shows the depolarization of the ventricles. So again, the polarization signal, it sends signals for the ventricles to contract, and that is now what we call a ventricular contraction or systole. So when the ventricles contract, there is a big increase in ventricular pressure, which we can also see in the ECG here. The blue line is the ventricular pressure, and it has a big increase. So within the stage of the QRS complex, there is a short phase in what we call the isovolumetric contraction. So in this stage, the volume and the amount of blood in the ventricles are all still the same. This is when the ventricles start to contract and it closes all the valves in our hearts. It lasts only until the semilunar valve opens. So on the other side of the semilunar valve is the aorta. So at this stage, the aortic pressure is somewhere around 80 milliliters of mercury. So for the blood to leave the ventricles, you have to have enough pressure to overcome this 80 milliliter of mercury. That's on the previous slide. There we can see there is a big increase in ventricular pressure. So that means that there is enough pressure in the ventricle for the semilunar valve to open. So when the semilunar valve open, the blood will now be leaving the ventricles, and that will result in a decrease in ventricular volume, which you can see again in the ECG. There is a slight decrease here, and this stage is what we call the ejection stage. Now moving on to the last part of the cardiac cycle, this is the T wave. Unlike the other two, the T wave shows the repolarization of the ventricles. This means that the ventricles are now all relaxed. they're in a state of relaxation, and it's what we call the ventricular diastole, because systole means contraction, diastole means relax. So because of the relaxation of the ventricles, there will be a big decrease in ventricular pressure, which we can see here in the ECG. There's a big decrease right here. So when that happens, the valves are going to close, and once the ventricular pressure goes below the atrial pressure, the AV valve and the other valves will once again open, and blood that's coming back from the body will start filling up the ventricles, and that will continue until the next P wave comes. So basically, this is the end of the cardiac cycle, and it will start again until the next P wave comes. So that is my understanding of the cardiac cycle. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.